Today is April 8, 2017, and we are in the Seventh-day Sabbath, and we'll be studying the community rule. Before we begin, let us ask our Heavenly Family to guide us. Eloheinu, our mighty ones, Heavenly Family, thank you so much for the principles of truth. Thank you for teaching us about how little we know and for showing us so much. Thank you for taking away our nothing to give us everything. Please help us in our discussion tonight to reason correctly, to have hearts full of love, and to honor you and bring about your kingdom. Please guide us in this. Help us to understand the true nature of the community rule and to learn many lessons along the way. Thank you. Todah. We ask these things b'shem tzemach, hu he, in the name of Branch, he and she. Amen.
Amen. Amen.
So, as we have been typically doing in these studies, we'll have a brief summary of what the community rule is and why we are investigating it, and then we'll move from there into comments and questions broadly related to the community rule, and then get into the place where we left off. So the community rule is a document or a text found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Several copies were found, and it is one of the most important scrolls that was found. And that is true for several reasons, one of which is that the text is the most complete telling of the purpose, identity, mission, beliefs, and practices of the Dead Sea Scroll community. And that community, as we have found in our previous studies, was somewhat of a forerunner to the Nazarenes, which was the movement surrounding Jesus. And this community is very important for a number of reasons. A lot of the unique ideas of that community were picked up and carried on by Jesus and his followers, indicating, of course, that they, in a sense, were a successor movement to that movement. The Qumran community itself was founded by an individual known in the scrolls as the Teacher of Righteousness. He had a prophetic mission and message, and the community rule sums up what some of that mission and message was. That is especially true in the section we are currently investigating, that being the teaching of the two ways, or the two spirits. And, another reason why the community rule is important for us is because in reading it, we can see that the mission that is outlined in that text is the mission that our Heavenly Family has given us, that being to bring about the final wiping away of sin. So there are, of course, other reasons why the community rule is important. It has a large amount of parallels with the New Testament, and it's a very early text from the Qumran literature, dating to the early part of the 2nd century BCE. And, it's also just, there are some explanations of things within the community rule that are not as clearly explained elsewhere. Certainly, the teaching of the two spirits is most fully treated here in the community rule. So the reason why we're investigating this is that we really do want to find out whether it is a product of inspiration, because if it is, we want to live it out in however it exactly applies to us today. And we really want to understand it in its true meaning. So we're testing it by comparing its claims to reality to find out whether they are so, and seeing if it teaches true righteousness. So that's our primary investigation here. The place that we are at right now is in column 4 of 1QS, 1QS being the best preserved of the copies of the community rule. And we started reading the paragraph from Geezer Vermez's translation that starts at line 15 of column 4. And it is starting to, in a sense, sum up the teaching of the two spirits while making some final points. So we'll continue there in a bit, but first, does anyone have any comments or questions more broadly related to the community rule?
Brother Hoda was similar, and our message is similar. Wouldn't we go with the later messages rather than the earlier ones? Because truth keeps unfolding, so why do we want to go back to this earliest one?
Okay, so as I understand the question, why do we want to study this message? Don't we want the newer messages, not the past messages, in a sense? So, of course, any message sent from our Heavenly Family is a message of truth, and new truth is never independent of the old. And, of course, that phraseology may sound familiar because Ellen White makes a very similar statement. Not only that, but there are elements of truth that have come in the past that have been lost. And in studying the past messages, we have a chance to gain an understanding of those unfortunately lost truths, or perhaps truths that were expressed in particularly powerful ways in past messages, and because of not having certain texts, we haven't had those wonderful expressions of truth. Yes?
The other thought that comes to my mind is, especially, well, I don't know if it's especially with this text or not, but, you know, let's consider the community rule. It was written before the life of Jesus. And so it's during the, what we would think of, the Old Testament period time. And if it's inspired, if it had been known about and recognized, it would have been canonized. And then we'd just have it in our Bible, and we would think, oh, don't throw out the Bible, right? I mean...
In other words, the Bible's past truth, too.
Exactly. Exactly. Any inspired message from the past, whether it's in the Bible or not, is valid, or it's unnecessary altogether. It stands or falls together, in other words. We have to use equal weights and measures when judging importance of inspired writings. And if we're going to say because something's not in the Bible and it's an old truth, then why do we need it? Then we would say the same thing about the Bible. We'd never bother reading it again. There's nothing there for us. Just go with the new stuff.
Very true. So in other words, you know, just to give another specific example from within the Bible, would we say the same thing about, let's say, the book of Isaiah? Well, that's just, you know, an ancient message, an ancient writing. Don't we need what's newer? Well, the new is composed of the old and understanding of the old. And especially understanding what Victor Hoff taught in terms of Joseph typology and how the 7 years of plenty represents the period prior to John, and the period after is represented by the 7 years of famine. And in the famine, we are to digest, in other words, understand all the truth that was stored up in the 7 years of plenty. And so, yes, this is very, very important for us to study, just as important as studying Isaiah or Ezekiel, Daniel, Jeremiah, whatever it may be. So does that help to answer your question? And are there any other questions or comments on that?
Thank you for the answer. That was a good answer. Satisfies my curiosity and my wanting to understand better.
Amen. Thank you, Heavenly Family. All right. So, unless there are other comments, we can continue on studying where we left off last night. I will read the sentence that we went through last night, and we'll see if there are any other comments or questions on it. So this is 1QS, column 4, line 15. In these, being the two spirits, are the generations of all the children of humanity. And in these divisions, all their hosts possess an inheritance for their generations. And in their paths they walk. So they walk in the paths of these two spirits. So, does anyone have any comments or questions in relation to this sentence that we perhaps didn't go through last night?
Well, I'll just say that in investigating this document, again, I would have to say that that's a true statement, that, there's no gradient of righteousness or wickedness. It's one or the other when you boil it all down. And so, yeah, I would agree.
Amen. I'd also agree that it's true that looking at the history of mankind, this term generations or accounts is often used to describe some sort of history, or I guess the word account is a really good one for this. It's an account of something. Looking at all the history of mankind, we can see that, people have some sort of influence for good or for evil. And you can see these two spirits, truth and falsehood, at work so clearly. And, today, this is just as manifest, if not more, than in previous generations, even though the distinction between these two spirits is often blurred. But I was doing a little bit of looking into the idea of pseudoscience again recently, and there is this distinction, and apparently the guy who at least popularized the distinction, and I believe he was actually the guy who first drew the distinction between science and pseudoscience, he looked at the methods of different people. Actually, the two people whose methods he was comparing was Freud and Einstein. And he noticed that Sigmund Freud would look at things in the past to draw a conclusion about the present, and that he could use conflicting things from the past to draw the same conclusion. So, for instance, if he noticed that someone has some psychological issue in relation to sex, he could say, oh, well, it's because they weren't given enough affection when they were young. But he could also say it's because they were given too much affection when they were young. So either thing could lead to what he sees as the result. But the problem with that is you can make anything evidence for your conclusion when that might not be the case. And then this person also observed Einstein and noticed, hey, wait a second, Albert Einstein isn't just looking at the past in order to draw conclusions about the present. He's actually looking at things in the present to draw conclusions about the future. And perhaps the future is a present reality, but just the observation has not yet been made. But Einstein would create a hypothesis that can be tested. And he said, well, according to my theory, if my theory is correct, then this is what we should see. And what this philosopher recognized is that Albert Einstein's approach is far more risky because it could be proven wrong quite easily. It's just if his prediction about what the observations would reveal didn't happen, well, then his theory is false. Whereas Sigmund Freud, you could use almost anything in order to demonstrate, as it were, the truth of his theory. And so he saw Freud's approach as being pseudoscientific and Einstein's approach as being genuinely scientific. And the distinction that he made was really to say that one is falsifiable and one is not. So Einstein's approach could easily be falsified, and you can test it by trying to show that it's not true, but you won't be able to successfully and genuinely do that, whereas a pseudoscientific approach is always seeking to confirm the hypothesis and will use anything to confirm it. I'm mentioning this as an example of this war between truth and falsehood. And today, that is very often manifest in what we might term science versus pseudoscience. Today, in the Western world, especially, but all around the world, really, we live in a quote-unquote scientific world. And everything has been updated to kind of fit within that world. But that doesn't mean that everything is truly scientific. Now, this is the thing. True science is determined by experiment. And thus, all true science is really in keeping with the principles that we've been learning in this message, because we've been talking about experimental knowledge. And this kind of science, pseudoscience difference is the same difference, ultimately, as experimental knowledge versus mere belief. And again, that's what Freud was kind of doing. You could set up a belief and then use anything to try and support that belief. But that's not experimental knowledge. And so, we see this all throughout the world today in whatever topic. And, looking at the Silver Trumpet, Volume 1, Number 9, kind of brings a bunch of the topics to view, whether you're talking about archaeology and pseudo-archaeology or medicine, pseudo-medicine, history, pseudo-history, whatever it may be. It's all about what can be experimentally verified and what can't be. And so often, when I look on the internet, there is just so much out there of people promoting beliefs without having an experimental knowledge. And those beliefs, quite frankly, most often are false. Perhaps every once in a while, yes, by fluke, someone will have a correct belief without having a genuine knowledge of it. That's bound to happen, of course. But the internet is full of misinformation and the promotion of falsehood. I see a lot of this as being a manifestation of this war between these two spirits. And so, yes, the nature of all the children of men is ruled by these two spirits, or otherwise stated, in these are the accounts of all of the children of humanity. And in these divisions all their hosts possess an inheritance for their generations. Now, I guess that could be expanded and viewed in many, many respects, but I figured this is an aspect that might not immediately come to mind. So does anyone have any comments or questions in relation to that, or anything else in relation to this first sentence?
I do.
Okay.
I'm just struck again by how many questions this understanding answers in regard to what we've understood as Adventists, in regard to the last great deception on the world, on the earth, and all that, and it being related to spiritualism. And I always thought that spiritualism was just the belief in a conscious state of the dead or something along those lines.
Seances.
Yeah. And or fortune telling, or, and it always seemed so unrealistic to me that anybody today would really fall for that, especially, well, I don't mean just in general. I know there's a lot of people that believe in seances and contacting the dead and all that. That's not really what I'm referring to when I say that it doesn't seem like anybody would believe in that. Mostly in the world of Adventism, because it's so, as far as I know, it's so widely understood that there's no conscious state of the dead. Nowadays I question what any Adventist might believe, because it's become so different. It's not Adventism anymore a lot of the time. But I never could understand how it would really be the thing in the world, this spiritualism overcoming people's beliefs. But when our Heavenly Family showed us all the different aspects of spiritualism, and how here I am thinking my whole life that I knew the difference, and I wasn't falling for spiritualism, but for however 15, 16, 17 years, however long it was, I most certainly not only fell for spiritualism, I was practicing spiritualism as a massage therapist. I was introduced to the idea of meridian lines and energy flow, chi, chakras, reflexology, zones of the body, muscle testing. I didn't do muscle testing, but I had seen people do it. People had done it on me.
And you thought it was legit.
Yeah. I wasn't sure on that specific,
okay.
but in general, I could see some inconsistencies as to if it was effective or not. But I really didn't question the idea behind it being everything gives off this energy field, and there's this kind of indiscernible flow of energy that goes through everything, and we have this influence on people depending on what kind of energy we have, what we're giving off, what our aura is like, you know, all this stuff. And it seems so harmless. It seems like a good thing. There's so many people out there who care about other people and they want to help them. And, you know, I fit into that category. I genuinely wanted to help people feel better, and I thought I was doing that. Well, often they would feel better. But it doesn't make what I was doing right. Satan heals people too. You know? He inflicts illness and disease. He removes it to show some form of healing. You know, hey, if he can keep people deceived into thinking in an immaterial way, then he's got control over our minds. And he had, you know, control in that area of my life where I would have been very offended if my methods were questioned, and I would have taken it personal and just resisted or denied that it was spiritualism, because it didn't have anything to do with life after death or anything like that. That's just silly. And my conspiratorial mindset really fed into that because, just because the medical world says that this can't be measured, well, what do they know? They you know, they're just using these finite tools, right? And there's been people, and the other reason, the other proof is because it's been done for so long. Like, I really thought that was a good reason to believe in meridian lines and acupuncture and that sort of thing, because
it's ancient.
It's ancient. Look at all these people who have performed this for so long. And, well, why would they continue to do that if it wasn't working? But the point is that whether it's quote-unquote working or not isn't even the issue. That is no evidence of whether or not it's from our heavenly family or based on materialism. And that's what the carnal mind doesn't want to deal with or accept, is that we can have benefit or think we have benefit and maybe be wrong about the cause of the benefit.
That's exactly it. I was actually just going to say that too. How, in fact, it doesn't work, period. You know, some of these ancient methods, just because people thought it worked doesn't mean it actually did work. Something else may have done something that they took as it working. And, okay, you know, just for example, I won't give a specific example, but pain is quite a subjective thing, and a lot of these pseudoscientific methods have to do with relief of pain, and pain is one of the things that can be done greatest just by using a placebo, you know, and people can receive pain relief even though there's nothing actually doing it other than them believing that they are receiving something to help with their pain, and they think that they have less pain, and so they interpret pain differently. And even someone can do this even without taking any sort of substance, just experiencing pain, and you just focus your attention on something else other than your pain.
I do it all the time.
And then your pain greatly lessens your experience of it, because you're just removing however much of it you are aware of, you are lessening your awareness of that and increasing your awareness on something else.
And let me just clarify by saying I do it all the time. And I know many of us here do that all the time, as far as, hey, we have pain maybe almost constantly, And, okay, what do? You're just going to go around complaining of your pain all the time? You're not going to do anything because you're hurt? Well, no. You got to live life. You have to do things. There's things to be done. So you just work through the pain, distract yourself, and you don't really notice it as much until it's, to a certain level, and then, well, you can't ignore that. But,
There's something else that you said that touches on a very important element, and this is really, in a sense, the front lines of the battle. And that is, you commented on how at that point you would have been offended with people questioning those methods and you wouldn't have seen it and that sort of thing. Well, that's just one aspect, but what that touches on is the fact that the real struggle is in the way that people approach all of these various subjects. Is someone willing to do a genuine experiment, to find out what genuine experiment is, to question whether or not they have genuine experience, that sort of thing. Those are the areas where it's really important. And, what we need to do as people who have been acquainted now through this message with the principles of truth and righteousness isn't so much about us going and correcting people's misconceptions on specific things. And that may be important in instances as well, but the primary thing is to encourage people to use the right methods of obtaining knowledge and to question whether they have been using the right methods. Because if they haven't been gaining an experimental knowledge, but they think they have, or they, maybe they don't think in those terms, of course, but they think that they have a genuine knowledge of something, well, really what they need isn't just to be shown that, oh, well, sorry, but your conclusion on this is wrong. They need to be shown that their methods of arriving at that conclusion are wrong and that they need to gain an experimental knowledge and they need to be educated about what that looks like. And so that's really what we need to be doing, because that's so much more important than the specifics, and it is just far more broad. It reaches way further than simply dealing with the specifics of any particular subject.
Yeah, there's an awful lot that could be said on this sort of thing, just contemplating it and discussing it, because it's a real stronghold in many of us. I can see many times the devil tries to tempt me, and does tempt me at the very least, and often succeeds in getting me to react negatively, even if the only thing that happens is I'm questioned. People don't even like to be questioned. Not even that. I'm not talking about being told that they're wrong, but even just to ask, how do you know that's true? Do you have evidence for that? Well, the fact is that if we had evidence for it, actual evidence, we wouldn't rise up against a question like that. We would just say, yeah, here it is. But because we don't have evidence, and deep down we know it, whether we acknowledge it or not, then it's like, don't question me. What's the matter with you? That's my personal belief. You don't have a right to question that. That's the devil's game often. But I'll tell you what, when I see that temptation coming, even if I have to struggle and try to reason through it, I recognize that it's the wrong spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And, if we recognize it's the wrong spirit, then we should be able to just recognize that, okay, there's something here. Let's get to the bottom of it. And we either want to really know the truth, or we just want to be able to believe whatever we believe. So hopefully we'll want to know the truth.
Amen. So any other comments or questions on the aspects we are discussing or on this first sentence?
I got a comment, I think.
Sure.
Even understanding how Jesus dwells in our hearts. We think that actual Spirit of Jesus dwells in us, not His truth. So we're believing in, that Jesus don't really have a body. He can dwell in our hearts. At Sabbath school this morning, I asked the teacher, how do we determine truth? She says, if it's in the Bible. So then I told her about materiality, and I want to give her that copy that Ed and John sent me. So I think that's the end of my thought.
Sure. No, that's a very common and good example of kind of how things go down. How people view things. And, hey, I used to think, well, yeah, comparing all things to the Bible is really what determines what is true. And, of course, though, now I can see how, oh, man, anyone can do that with anything. And then how do you know that the Bible is true? And so on and so forth. So it's, yes, quite an interesting circumstance. And that's all part of the battle, just educating people to view things in terms of reality. But, it's actually a simple thing in a sense, because it really doesn't make sense to do things otherwise. And anyone can understand the simple reality that if we make statements that don't match reality, they are not true. And you can give millions of examples to someone to show that point, and people will agree with the examples, because if I say you're not hearing my voice right now, obviously that's false. And what it means for it to be false is that you are actually hearing it, and thus the statement does not match reality. It's a very, very simple thing. If I say you are hearing my voice, that's true, and all that means is that my statement corresponds with material reality. That's something that anyone can really understand. And thus, regardless of what any book says, even if it matches reality or if it doesn't, truth is not determined by what it says. And anyone who believes in the Bible, you could always point out, well, what about before any of the books of the Bible were written? What did it mean for something to be true then? Well, it couldn't be that it matches the Bible, because there was no such thing as the Bible. So, just...
I'm so grateful to understand this.
Oh, me too.
I really do want to see the truth vindicated, because most people who profess belief in God just really promote the most ridiculous ideas. And every one of us here has played a part in that. We've all had those same ridiculous ideas.
Indeed.
Some of us more than others, and I'm one of those more than other people.
So, anyone else? Okay, well, let us go on to the next sentence here. And the whole reward for their deeds shall be for everlasting ages, according to whether each man's portion in their two divisions is great or small. Any comments?
Actually, to be honest with you, it's a little bit confusing to me because what it sounds like to me is I'm assuming the two divisions are either the light or the darkness, and my understanding is you're fully in the light or you're fully in the darkness. So it's the word portion is kind of confusing within this context because I was thinking it was all or none to be in one category or the other.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's I can see many people possibly being confused with this sentence. It really comes back to what we discussed last night, that being that everyone is in one division or another, but the portion that one receives of one spirit or the other varies. So someone could have the Spirit of truth and be walking according to the Spirit of truth and receive a greater portion of truth than someone else who has the Spirit of truth and is walking according to the Spirit of truth. Likewise, someone could be on the path of error and receive a great portion, as in a large portion of error and falsehood and everything that goes along with it, whereas someone else might receive a lesser portion.
This is all coming back to me now. I'm remembering you mentioning this last night. And, just like if someone ends up being lost, well, they're not going to receive the same sentence as another person who maybe, let's say someone's lost and they didn't hurt a lot of people or really, and they were selfish as far as they didn't want to follow the truth in every regard, but, they had a line that they would not cross. But then you have someone else who crossed that line and many more and did lots of bad things, hurt a lot of people. And, their reward, so to speak, is going to be different.
Yes, absolutely.
And same for, on a positive sense, most people don't think of that very often, but, we do know from some visions Ellen White has had how there will be people who stand closest to Jesus. And that just makes sense in a material world. Mm-hmm. Not everybody can fit up next to one person. But I know it's not going to be like that. Like, we're not all going to stand in the same spot all the time either.
Right.
But point being that some people will have a different rank. Their reward will be greater or lesser in that regard. And that's just the way it is now in the government of our Heavenly Family anyway. It was the way it was before the fall. It's the way it is now. It's the way it'll be throughout eternity. There's a hierarchy.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's essentially the simple meaning of the phrase. It's pointing out that the entire reward, and again, reward is, we usually use the word reward in a positive sense, but it can also be used in a negative sense. It's just someone receiving what they, basically the whole idea of what you...
Reaping what you sow.
Yeah, exactly.
Just like you said last night.
Yeah, exactly. Reaping what you sow. So this is just getting what, quote unquote, is coming to them, whether good or bad. And what someone receives is according to whether their portion in these two divisions, either truth or error, is great or small.
Understanding it that way, it makes sense to me. I was having a hard time too, Ed. I was looking at that thinking, I'm really missing something here. I'm not understanding. Doesn't sound right. But I totally get it, and I can wholeheartedly say that I agree with that. It's a true statement.
Amen.
I agree too, and thank you for helping me out there, Teresa.
I had a comment.
Amen. Yeah, sure.
Well, then listening, especially to Teresa's comment there, that is a misunderstanding with most people in the world, because there's a lot of good people, they pass away, and everyone expects them to be in heaven. A lot of people, many people, believe that we're all going to be the same. And in a way, I mean, we are all loved by our heavenly family. But that's just not a concept most people think about, that there's going to be a hierarchy. That doesn't even sound very nice to a lot of people's ears. And yet, Mr. White says, and maybe Scripture does too, there's going to be more jewels in the crowns of people. The more people that they were instrumental in bringing to the Lord, their crowns are going to be full of jewels. And some people are going to have 4 or 5, or some people have hundreds. And so that's the form of more reward for certain people as well. But hopefully we can all keep in mind is everybody will be happy with what they have. The very lowest position will be so wonderful that everybody will be happy. And those who don't make it would actually not be happy in heaven. And when that is realized, then I think people truly understand that God is truly love, because, of course, He can't jeopardize eternity with anyone who hasn't totally given all and totally wants to obey all the principles for their own good and the good of everyone else. But the people that don't want to obey all those principles, in time, now maybe for a while they'd be happy, but in time it would all start over again. And so I think that's why we're told every knee will bow, because at that moment they all realize this judgment is just. And they realize,
Amen.
They wouldn't be happy there. They wouldn't even be able to live in the presence of the light and the glory of heaven. So I think that's also part of it. They realize that they couldn't even exist in that environment. So it's all going to be right, no matter if we don't understand it all right now anyway. But having attended a couple of funerals in the last few years, it's obvious that is what a lot of people think, that whoever is resurrected in the resurrection of the just, even if that's not where, even if they realize, hey, I didn't go straight to heaven, I'm being resurrected from the grave, it'll all be fine if they're saved. And that's the most important thing.
I think it's interesting, too, the Shintoism study about how, Buddha was righteous and Muhammad and so on. When you start to look at, their portion of righteousness, they didn't know God or know our God, the God of Israel. However, they weren't living in the spirit of darkness, so they had a portion of light without darkness, and that would obviously be, as we've studied, they would heaven couldn't keep them out. Their righteousness would bring them to heaven. So anyway, that obviously they would have I would assume a small portion in terms of knowing the heavenly family. They could have a large portion in terms of following through with righteousness. But anyway, that kind of lines up and fits that principle.
Amen, yeah. And another element that I don't think people think of much is how, certain ancient Jewish texts describe some wicked angels as being more wicked than others. Some having lines that they will not pass, and others just being happy to do all sorts of wickedness. And it only makes sense. I mean, when you look at people are very different from each other. Everyone's unique. No one's exactly the same. And, that's just the way it is. And so it makes sense. This is kind of another way to say that everyone is going to be dealt with as individuals. It's not like everyone is just put in a category and, oh, yeah, you're in this category, therefore this is what you get. No, everyone is treated individually.
Living those 100 years under the complete power of Satan would truly be a living hell. It would, people fear hell because they think it's just burning. But those 100 years, approximate, whatever, it is, those 100 years when the wicked are raised and they have that time that they're preparing their implements for or whatever, they're completely under the power of Satan. And I think it changes them to be even worse than they were when they went into the grave. That's, maybe I shouldn't have even said that because I don't think we're told that, but if we are, I don't know it. But I would think that would be so horrible to have to live those 100 years under the complete power of Satan and everybody being so mean to each other, and it just doesn't sound good.
I've had kind of a similar thought in my life too about what the wicked will do during those 100 years. And so as you were talking, I was really contemplating it, and I was just asking myself silently, well, is that true? And, I'm not sure. And what I mean by is that true, I'll specify the aspect of if they're completely under the control of Satan, that maybe they'll do more than what they would have otherwise, or they'll be like more wicked than they were before they died originally and all that. And then it just occurred to me, I'm not sure that is true because, but I'm not saying that I believe that it's not true. I'm just questioning. We always have choice, but since we know that Satan doesn't want us to have any choice and he can manipulate us, it might be that if he has full control over all the wicked, that he's able to manipulate them to a degree, just like someone might hypnotize a person and cause them to do something that normally they wouldn't choose to do.
Right.
But so I'm not sure, and I don't know. I don't think that inspiration talks about that specifically or not. But I was just, at first I was thinking, well, but we're all going to have free choice throughout eternity, and the wicked will have choice too during those 100 years. But then I kind of wondered, well, but Satan doesn't play fair. So.
Yeah, but still, just because Satan doesn't play fair doesn't mean that they'll have no choice. People have a choice as to whether or not they'll have choice or not. In other words, like even, to be hypnotized, someone has to be, in some way willing or susceptible to
Yeah.
that sort of thing. So all we're told is that he'll go forth to deceive the nations, however subtle or whatever that may be. And in terms of whether or not they'll be more wicked or not, well, it's not like people will be resurrected to be a different way than they originally were, because character doesn't change because of, being resurrected. But both wickedness and righteousness are progressive in nature, in that they are not static. They change and they develop, and someone who goes in wickedness inevitably will become more and more wicked. One who is entering righteousness will become more and more righteous. That being, if someone sets their path on something. Of course, someone can be wicked and progress in purity zones to give up their wickedness and then become righteous. But still, they are not static zones. It will continue on developing in one direction or another. So like Ellen White points out, if we're not advancing, we are retrograding.
And if fallen angels, some are more wicked than others after all this time, then, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I really was questioning, like, how would that work? Because it didn't seem like it really fit with what I understood for anybody to no longer have free choice, and the understanding of, it's even a choice to be able to be hypnotized and suggestions made that you follow and that sort of thing. But yeah, if the fallen angels, there's some that just aren't quite as wicked as others, even now, then after thousands of years, then it's not a stretch to think that there will be people alive during the 100 years that today we wouldn't even really consider wicked at all. It's just, from the world standards, they're not out killing or raping or stealing or whatever. It's just, some of what we perceive as the worst sins, but, maybe they do some other things and we wouldn't think of it quite the same.
I guess time will tell.
Yeah, it's kind of been touched on, and I was thinking along these lines as well. When the angels that fell were cast out of heaven, they were just the other side of being holy at that time. Well, of course, we don't know how long the one in heaven lasted or anything like that, but as Teresa was bringing out, they have progressed to be worse, and if some are worse than others, I haven't read that part, but I could certainly understand it. And then getting back to those who are lost, everyone made their choices before they went into the grave or when they were struck dead at Christ's coming. Their choice had already been made because their probation was over. And then my last comment is going to be, in order to march on the city with the intent of trying to take the city, there has to be a lot of hate-filled people there. And so I do believe that it will be progressive. 100 years is quite a while in our way of, most people are lucky to live 100 years, today, or 80 or whatever. So 100 years is quite enough time to, a lot of people are going to realize they're lost during that time too. So anyway, those are my comments that, the angels in heaven didn't just immediately turn into the worst things in the universe and everything. So I think time will tell, of course, as you said. So anyway, it's going to be a sad thing. That's all I can say.
You said something that reminded me of part of our discussion, whether it was Tuesday or Wednesday night, I don't remember, but you used the phrase, I believe it'll be the case that the wickedness will be progressive during those 100 years, et cetera, et cetera. And but then at the very end, you expressed uncertainty. Yeah, I guess time will tell, you said, that sort of thing. And I was just reminded how, and like I said, whether it was Tuesday or Wednesday night, again, like I said, I don't remember, but like I said, that this has been something that I've only recently started to recognize and to catch on my own without it being pointed out to me, is that we should never believe anything that we don't know. And thinking something is a certain way is the same as believing it is a certain way. So we should never think something is a certain way. We should never believe something is a certain way unless we actually know it is that way. And I just thought this was a fitting time to mention what we had discussed, because partly just because I'm I was glad that I am starting to recognize that, and it makes sense to me that there might be many of us here that don't catch that yet, because it's still such a new way of thinking for us. You know, we've all been so used to having beliefs that weren't verified, and it just seems normal. What?
I remember that night when we were talking about it.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people say that without realizing what it truly does mean. I don't think a lot of people are making a statement that I believe this is carved in stone type of thoughts. They don't truly believe it's a carved in stone. They're just saying, I'm on the fence. I believe it might be that. Like say, you're thinking, oh, I think it might be that, but we don't really know. So I think a lot of people mean it in that way, not in the carved in stone way. Whereas you might say, I believe this is carved in stone the way it is. And then someone else might say, I believe something, and they're saying, I have questions. I believe it might be that way. Sometimes the inflection in the voice gives it away what they really mean. So but we do need to practice knowing what we know and not saying it if we don't know. So that's a good thing to remember.
Sure, and obviously I think you're right that most people when they say that aren't trying to say it's carved in stone, but the problem is that people often think that it's perfectly acceptable to believe things that are not carved in stone. when in reality the whole thing is, hey, wait a second, if we don't actually have something carved in stone, we don't have something that we can verify and demonstrate and all of that. And what I mean by demonstrate isn't to absolutely, quote-unquote, prove something to the point where no one can doubt, because you can't do that with anything. I mean to evidence sufficiently to demonstrate or to show that it is so. So those are all different aspects to that. And the other thing to keep in mind, just, for ourselves, and obviously, we can't expect other people who don't understand these principles to follow them. So I'm just saying this for our own benefit here, for the benefit of everyone who is wanting to understand these principles. The other thing is that even if we say, I believe it might be this way, upon what do we base the fact that something might be a certain way? That's another thing that we have to keep in mind, that to claim that something is probable or to think that something is probable, which is equivalent to claiming it to be the case even just to ourselves, is a claim that needs to be evidenced. Is it actually the case that something is even possible or probable? And, if we think, well, it might be this case or more likely this than another thing, what evidence do we have that it's more likely one way as opposed to another. In other words, it can't just be that a certain idea just happens to come across that way to us. Because often something will come across as more likely to us just because we are more familiar with it. But our familiarity with something has nothing to do with its actual probability. And so those are all things to keep in mind, that really, in a sense, we have to be strict with ourselves in what we believe, even when it's having a belief in terms of the possibility or probability of something rather than its certainty. The thing is, it's still a belief one way or the other. So all points to keep in mind.
You know, it's really interesting. A few weeks back, within several meetings anyway, you had made a point, and I'm guilty of this. I'm one of the people you were making a point to. But I've noticed, I've caught myself so many times now, where we're thinking of what we're going to say, our comments, and not paying attention to what you're saying or what somebody else who's talking is saying, and and missing, because of our thought process, we're missing a really important principle, and it's a tool that Satan's using. Myself, my nature, my personal nature, and maybe a lot of people have the same nature, but I know Satan's using it on me. I want to have something to say. I don't know if it's an ego boost or whatever, and so I'm thinking of this clever thing to say, and I keep catching myself ever since you made that comment, just not necessarily on the call anymore, but just in my life. I mean, I'm catching myself doing this all the time. I want to have something to say. So I'm pondering, what am I going to say? And I'm not really paying attention and giving heart to what someone else is saying, especially like my wife or my mother or, people that are really important to me as well. I'm missing their point, So anyway, it all adds into that, and it's a way for Satan to use our nature to prevent us from hearing the truth.
I'm very glad that you mentioned that and said it, just because it's so encouraging to hear how the truth can really impact someone's life. Mm-hmm. Like you're saying how, okay, now you're catching yourself, in those circumstances, hey, wait a second, and that in itself is just awesome, because it just shows how, like, this is just an example of how the truth can change us. Mm-hmm. It seems like such a simple thing, but it really can, because we hear it, and if we hear it and recognize it and just keep it in mind, I mean, that's going to change a whole lot. So that's a beautiful thing. Thank you, Heavenly Family.
Yeah, I have to also say that understanding that principle, and I can understand it better, like I have room to grow there, that's for sure, but it has made such a big difference in my relationships, whether they're close relationships or very casual relationships. Like it's someone I'm meeting for the first time, don't really know them at all, but I find myself more naturally listening to people, to actually want to understand what they're saying, not just making some snap judgment as to what kind of person they're like or what they probably mean, or getting all wrapped up in, I have something I want to say to these people. They need to hear what I have to say. And then totally missing anything they have to say, and what they have to say may actually inform you of what they need to hear.
Exactly. I was actually thinking of that same idea. And another thing that I think is important in relation to this principle is that practicing listening with other individuals is actually equipping us to conduct proper experiments. And in fact, conversing with someone is a form of experiment. Let's just say we're witnessing to someone about the present truth message, and we have two options: listen to them or not listen to them. Them being the other. Well, if we do listen to them, it has this element that Teresa just mentioned of showing us what we ought to say to them, because we can see what they need if we just take the time to listen to them.
Or what they're ready for, or what they're not ready for.
And what they're not ready for is often most important, because if you realize, this person isn't ready for this, you know that you can avoid that point, because it will be a stumbling block to them, and start with other things that they are more ready to hear at that moment. And so really, this is setting up for a genuine experiment. All genuine experiments start with observation. You're not going to just go and test just anything. Just like, you don't go into a doctor's office and say, "Hey, doc, I'm feeling sick." And then he starts running a whole bunch of experiments on everything. Or starts giving you all sorts of medications on everything. No, first, a good doctor will listen to you to find out, okay, so what are your symptoms, what's happening, and start narrowing things down to know what you need at that moment. Well, that's basically what's happening with communicating to people about the message. Listening is very important. Being aware of our hearers is very important, because we need to know what they need at that moment. And we can't just, have a pattern and a form, basically
some formula.
Cutter, yeah, cookie cutter evangelism.
It's not about what we like and what we're excited about, and now, we're just going to tell everybody about the points that we like the most, or that are newest to us and we're excited to know, and, we don't take into consideration sometimes that it took us a while to get to this point, and then we can't just go out and kind of beat someone over the head with it and expect them to really even understand what we're talking about, or to find it reasonable at all if they don't have, better reasons for it presented to them. So.
Yes, absolutely. So, all important. Toda Eloheinu. So I'm just looking at the time here, and we've been on for an hour and 20 minutes. We only have 10 minutes left before our calling card goes out. So I'm wondering if anyone has any final comments on what we've been discussing. Well, I'll say that the community rule certainly shows itself time and time again to be an instigator for good discussion.
That's for sure.
Of course, we're going beyond what the community rule itself is talking about. This time we've kind of stepped into application of the same principles which it discusses in our own day, and that's absolutely wonderful, because we really need to understand how these principles apply and live them out. So that said, would anyone like to thank our Heavenly Family, and then we will end the meeting?
I will. Heavenly Family, thank you for just directing our conversation to really some very, very good and helpful principles. Thank you for helping us to understand the intention of this document, the community rule, and help us to, as we continue investigating this document, help us to really come to a true knowledge of whether it's inspired by you or not, and if we should be implementing all of what it contains. And of course, so far, I would have to say that it's definitely promoting truth and righteousness. And up to this point, I can say that we should be implementing it. And I just thank you for all the discussions that we've had on it, because it's helping to bring these principles more to the forefront in understanding. So thank you, Heavenly Family. Please help us, strengthen us against the temptations of the enemy, and help us to be effective laborers for you. I ask this in the name of Branch. Amen.
Amen.